This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform for building your brand and growing your business online. If you're wanting to read fantasy books, well, you probably haven't come to like the best place, but you've come to a place to hear about them. Therefore, you might be in the right place. I don't know. Really though, hello and welcome to today's video. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, maybe, I don't know. You might be able to tell from the title of today's video that I'm going to be talking to you about all my fantasy books today. And not just like telling you about them, but what I'm doing is kind of giving you guys a little bit of an intro course. So today I'm your teacher. Hi. Call me Miss Sidwell, or don't actually, because I don't really like that. I am going to be talking to you guys about every single fantasy book that I've read. These are all of the fantasy books that I've read. A lot of these are just multiple copies of the same book. Actually, I haven't read these two, but I've read everything else, except for Harry Potter and some of those. But I've read most of them. But basically, this is kind of like a fantasy, like you guys know those like blank for dummies books. This is kind of like fantasy for dummies, book talk version, if I'm being honest. Like all of these books are probably the most hyped up books that you can find in the fantasy realm. And so if you're wanting to get into it, I will tell you basically what books that I think are good for getting into the fantasy genre. And the way that I kind of gauge that is like world building, because sometimes world building is a little bit hard. Like if you're first getting into a fantasy series and it has like very extensive world building and a lot of magic that you have to learn and stuff, I'll tell you kind of what the vibe is with that. So let's just get straight into it and talk about fantasy books. Okay guys, before we get into the meat of today's video, I do want to say a huge thank you to the sponsor of today's video, which is Squarespace. I've talked about Squarespace multiple times on my channel. You guys know that I absolutely love them. And if you guys are looking to launch, whether that's like an online storefront, a blog, or whatever it may be, Squarespace is 100% the way to go. I've talked about Squarespace so many times, but still, I'm going to tell you guys again some of my favorite parts of Squarespace. First of all, we have the member areas. Member areas helps you unlock a new stream of revenue, and it helps free up some of your time. This way you can be monetizing your content in a way that fits you and it fits your brand. You do this by selling access to gated content, whether that's videos, blog posts, online courses, whatever it may be that fits with your brand. Also, they do have their blogging and commenting tools. This basically allows people to interact within your website. So this builds a sense of community within your website, and they can also share your posts, they can comment back to each other. You can also use this tool to categorize your content, schedule your content, and share your posts. So my personal favorite feature is just how easy it is to connect all of your socials in one place. All you have to do is click website domain, you click the social media that you want, and bada bing, bada boom, it's right on there, and anyone can see it and anyone can share it. You guys can go to squarespace.com to start a free trial, and when you guys are ready to launch, you guys can go to squarespace.com/DestinySidwell to save 10% off on your first purchase of your website or domain. Thank you guys again so much to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and let's get into the meat of today's video. Okay, so we're gonna literally start at the top. At the top, we're gonna go like this. What else? What other series would I be talking about other than Acotar? And here's the thing. Odds are that if you are wanting to get into fantasy, I would probably give it a 95% that you have heard about Acotar. If not, I would be heavily surprised, because I feel like this is like, if you're getting into fantasy, there's a few series that I think that people want to immediately go into, and I definitely feel like Acotar is at the top of a lot of people's list. That's how it was for me. Acotar was one of the first like fantasies that I had read, because I didn't ever really like fantasy growing up, so this was one of the first that I had gotten into, and it wasn't the first. But first of all, you start off with Acotar. This is what the whole entire series starts with and is about. And here's the thing, when I first got into this, I think I had read the Cruel Prince trilogy, which we will talk about, but I think I had read that. I'm not too sure that I had read another fantasy book until I read Acotar, because like I said, I just wasn't really necessarily a fantasy reader. Those just like weren't books that I really gravitated towards. But when I read this from a beginner's perspective, the world building wasn't too hard. I'm about to call this intermediate, but I know all the fantasy girlies are gonna be like, babe, that is so easy to understand. From like a genuine beginner's perspective, this was like kind of a little, not like difficult, but sometimes I like had to reread, which doesn't mean like it's hard. I don't necessarily feel like the world building is bad in terms of like not being able to understand it. I think it's more of like the characters. There's like a lot of characters and they like connect in a lot of ways, that especially as you go through the series. Basically just like characters, how they connect and their magic and stuff. That could be confusing at times, but honestly, from a beginner's perspective, I thought it was very simple to understand. And of course, I would always recommend Acotar. And if you're wanting to go into it as a beginner, if you're wanting to go into it as a beginner, I don't feel like you will have very many issues at all. These are all of the books that are out in the Acotar series right now. We don't know when the next book is going to come out. A Court of Silver Flames didn't come out too long ago. These books are all from Feyre's perspective, and that's who you start out the series with. But good luck. I love the Acotar series literally so much. That's why I have like 3 different copies of the whole entire series. Still, this is like my Sarah J Maas shelf. So to talk about Sarah J Maas, she wrote the Acotar series, she wrote Throne of Glass, and she's writing Crescent City. She's like wrote all of these, and I'm literally obsessed with every single one, and they basically interconnect in ways that you will learn after you read all 3. Sorry, there's a lot of pages that you're gonna have to read to understand. Let's talk about Throne of Glass. This is gonna maybe surprise some people. I would honestly recommend people to read this series first if you're wanting to get into Sarah J Maas, not if you're wanting to get into fantasy. If you're wanting to get into fantasy, I would 100% say read the Acotar series first, just because I feel like it is the 100% more simple one to get into. Throne of Glass is a little bit different because Throne of Glass is fairly simple to understand. I honestly don't feel like there was a lot of world building with that one, but if I'm not mistaken, she started writing Throne of Glass when she was like fairly young, like, and not really like into all of her books yet. It was very easy to understand. As you get into these, however, a lot more difficult to understand. The world building in this series particularly is huge and has a lot to it, a lot that you have to pay attention to, and there's just a lot going on. But I love Throne of Glass literally so much. I read the whole entire Throne of Glass series this year, fell in love with it. I think about it literally every single day. I love the characters, I love the whole entire storyline. Honestly, the female MC that is in this book is my favorite female MC I think that I've ever read. She is just such a powerhouse within herself. She cares so deeply about the people around her and has this like fierce protection for everybody. Honestly, the world and the setting and just the characters and the interpersonal relationships between everybody I like more than Acotar, but Acotar holds such a special place in my heart. But this one, honestly, like the plot of these books are more interesting than Acotar. They're a lot more interesting, and there's a lot more depth that goes into the series than Acotar, I feel. But also Acotar is still an ongoing series, but I would say I do love Throne of Glass for that. Is it super beginner friendly? Throne of Glass is, and Crown of Midnight is, because they take place in the same thing. Because Throne of Glass basically starts out where she is a trained assassin, and she's basically competing in what is essentially like a Hunger Games to be like the king's assassin. So both of these take place kind of like that, but then stuff starts to like change. I've said before that once you get to like Heir of Fire, it feels like a completely different series, just with the same characters. Like it doesn't even feel like the same storyline, because it's not. It's very important what these 2 books are. Also, the Assassin's Blade. One thing that I forgot to talk about with Throne of Glass is that there are reading orders. There's tons of different reading orders. Not tons, that's like super dramatic. But there's multiple different reading orders that are talked about on the internet, and everyone thinks that theirs is right. I'll tell you personally, what I did was I kept on getting people telling me, no, read Assassin's Blade after Heir of Fire. No, after Heir of Fire, or after Crown of Midnight, before Heir of Fire, or after Heir of Fire. After Crown of Midnight, read it as the 3rd book, so Throne of Glass, Crown of Midnight, then the Assassin's Blade. I'm going to tell you this. I wanted to read the Assassin's Blade before I read this series. I am going to ask you guys to please read the Assassin's Blade first for multiple different reasons. There is like a huge thing that happens in the Assassin's Blade that then is talked about even in Throne of Glass, so that gets like spoiled for you if you want to read that book as the 3rd book in the series. I would 100% recommend, if you want a more like hard-hitting emotional read, to read the Assassin's Blade first, because you learn a lot of backstory about the female MC. Like that's basically all this is just a bunch of short novellas that are a prequel to the whole entire Throne of Glass series. And to me, if it's a prequel, I want to read it before the series, but I said that I wanted to read it before, and I got so many comments of people being like, no, you need to read it as the 3rd book, blah, blah, blah. I wish I would have read it as the 1st book. It would have hit so much harder if I would have read it as the first book. But I'm asking you guys to read it as the first book because even though some people in the comments are going to disagree with me, I just feel like it would hit harder. So then you have Throne of Glass, Crown of Midnight, Air, Fire, Queen of Shadows, Empire of Storms, Tower of Dawn, Kingdom of Ash. Here's the funny thing. I tandem read, which means you are basically reading both of these books at the same time, Empire of Storms and Tower of Dawn, because they take place at the same exact time, but it just follows two different characters. So in this one, you're following a side character that is a pretty big side character, and you are following them on like their mission, and then in Empire of Storms, you're following everybody else, but it takes place in the same exact time. I tandem read them because personally, I do not even think that I could have just read Tower of Dawn. Like, I don't think I could have just like sat down and read it. You can look up literally any reading order. I just looked up Tower of Dawn tandem read, and literally I just clicked the first one that popped up. Like, there, I don't really think that it necessarily matters. But then Kingdom of Ash is like a 1,000-page book, but it's absolutely amazing. I have both of these covers because I love the Throne of Glass series so much. But like I said, I don't feel that it is extremely beginner friendly. I feel like it gets a lot more complicated, and I read these this year, and I've read honestly quite a bit for me personally in the fantasy genre. And these were still a little bit difficult for me to understand because I'm not like a seasoned professional at fantasy. Moving on, the last Sarah J Maas series that we have to talk about, Crescent City. Crescent City, I feel like, is Sarah J Maas's like new baby because these books are fairly new. I think House of Sky and Breath came out not that long ago. Like, I think it came out in either 2021 or 2022. I'm not too sure. 2022. And actually, that's a quick turnaround for Sarah J Maas because the next book in this series is actually coming out in January of 2024. I cannot wait. It's like over 1,000 pages, and I told everybody to expect no text back from me on the 24th through the 26th because I am literally just going to sit down and read that whole entire book. Crescent City by Sarah J Maas. This one, if you're wanting to read like the whole entire Sarah J Maas like universe, it's called the Massiverse, I would recommend reading these last. So I would read Acotar and Throne of Glass. No. I would read Acotar, Throne of Glass, and then I would read these because when I went into this, I started this at like the very end of 2022, and this was genuinely, I remember even posting about it, this was the hardest book fantasy wise that I have ever had to get into. And it is so odd because I don't know what time period to necessarily put fantasy books in because they don't declare a time period. They're just kind of, I almost want to say medieval, like they kind of have that medieval fashion to them, very long ago. This series is modern fantasy. If you guys don't know what modern fantasy is, that is basically when a fantasy book takes place in like our time period. So it takes place now. They have cell phones, they have cars, they have everything. It was very, I didn't know that this was like modern times. So when I went into House of Earth and Blood and they were driving cars and they had social media and they were calling and going to clubs, I was genuinely flabbergasted. It didn't even feel like a Sarah J Maas book at first, but that's because I didn't know that. So you're going into it knowing that. And the world building and the characters and everything in this book honestly took me such a long time to get into. And I remember even going on TikTok because I was like, okay, I know people love this little series that's going on. How am I not getting into it? Like, how I don't understand. So many people have the same problem, that literally getting into the first like 30-40% through this book is very hard. But once I got through that, I loved every second of it. The characters, the storyline, everything. One thing about Sarah J Maas is she will make the ending of a book absolutely exquisite. Nothing compares to the ending of this book, however. Literally, I have been begging Sarah, like begging her to get to Crescent City. I'm like, you have to read it before January. Like, you have to. I need your reactions on the House of Sky and Breath because this book was my first 5-star read of this year because I read this at the end of 2022 and this was one of the first books that I picked up in 2023. This book is absolutely amazing. I cannot wait for Crescent City 3. I literally have a whole entire full spoiler reading vlog on my channel of this, so if you guys have read this book or when you read this book and you go back, you can watch that. It's like over an hour long. I love this book so much. I genuinely cannot wait for it. Like I said, it's modern fantasy, so it gives me a little bit something different from Sarah J Maas. Once you learn and read this book, it makes you so excited for everything that she's going to release here on out. But this one, honestly, I would put at a very difficult when it's on like a beginner scale. It just, something about the world building in this book was a little bit more difficult for me personally. And when I went on TikTok, that was the general consensus. Not to like say like whatever, but yeah, we're done with Miss Sarah J Maas. So let's move down a peg, we're gonna move to this. So, okay, this little, I forget what this series is called, but I just read these this year, which is Once Upon a Broken Heart and The Ballad of Never After. These are in the same series. The third book is coming out in October, which I absolutely, positively cannot wait for. But this, honestly, I would say is super beginner friendly for the point that it is not, there's no world building. Honestly, you just get put into this world because it's not a super like complicated magic system. It's very fairy tale-esque. If you guys have just like heard me talk about this duology since I've read it, it is just like, you guys have heard this by now, but it is very much Alice in Wonderland. It's not like having to build up this whole entire like magical world. Like, it is a magical world, but you don't even have to build it up because you just kind of understand. It's just like when you throw yourself into a fairy tale, like you just know that this isn't like how we live. And that is very much how these books are. There's no world building, so I feel like it is like the most, honestly, out of all of the fantasy books, I would probably say that this is the easiest one to get into, in my personal opinion, because you're just thrown into the story literally directly off the bat, and it is so good from start to finish. And the love interest in this book is so good. And the third book is coming out in October, like I have already stated, and I cannot wait for it. The way that The Ballad of Never After ends off, your jaw will be on the floor. This is basically about Evangeline, and she makes a deal with what is called the Fates. They're basically just like these people that live in this world that have these powers, and they can grant you a wish, and she makes a deal with one of the Fates. This is the appropriate time to talk about Caraval. Caraval takes place in the same universe as these two books previously talked about. I will tell you this, a lot of people will say read the Caraval trilogy before you read this. You don't need to. It's just that the fate that is in this book is also in this series. I just read Caraval. I never continued on with the series because while this was like a pretty fast, easy, simple read, I just didn't particularly enjoy it enough to want to continue on with the series, but I've heard great things about the series. This is the same. I would say that it is very beginner friendly. It is not a super complicated magic system. Again, you were not even thrown into any world building. It is very much like that, like kind of reminds me of like, I don't want to say medieval times, because all you will think about is like knights in shining armor, but like that time period, I don't know how to describe this, but anyway, you were literally just like in that time period, and then you go to Caraval, which is like this very like magical circus of sorts, and there's like a whole entire game and mystery that you're unraveling, and it is very, like I said, a very fast-paced read, but I just like didn't connect to the characters and what was going to happen to them enough to want to continue on with the series. But I would say that this series is extremely beginner friendly if you are looking for a fantasy series to go into that isn't too magic heavy, but it has a little bit of magic and it is that little fantasy realm. I would say Caraval is a good one to get into. Next up, we have Heart of the Raven Prince. This is like a whole entire series. It's called Entangled with Fae, and even though this looks like a young adult book, it is not a young adult book. Like, I thought it was a young adult series, but I guess it's not. So I read this one. I don't necessarily know. I think this is the first one. All of them are fairy tale retelling, so this one was a Cinderella retelling. I think you can tell if you were looking at the series. So this is about Fae, and to break this down for you guys, if you've never read a fantasy book, Fae are basically fairies, but they're not like the fairies that you're thinking of. Sometimes they may be the fairies that you're thinking of, but other times they are very different, and authors write Fae in very many different ways. But in fantasy, honestly, Fae is like the most popular that authors go with, and they're basically fairies, but you'll learn through different authors like what they want. In the Acotar series, they're Fae. In Throne of Glass, she's like Fae, I think, and then there are Fae in like Crescent City. But this one, it is about Fae, and it is just a Cinderella retelling. I forget what I rated this one. It was a cute, easy, simple read if you're wanting like a Cinderella retelling, but I don't think this is like stuck with me in any way. But I remember it being super simple. Like, there's not really a magic system to learn here either. It's more focusing, I feel like, on just a Fae version of the Cinderella story. Kingdom of the Wicked. Now, this is one of them that if you are somebody that has scrolled through Book Talk and you're looking for fantasy reads, you probably came across the Kingdom of the Wicked. This is a part of a series. I forget what this series is called, but I did read this first book. I did not like this book literally at all. This is about like witches, and there's like princes of hell, and there's like envy. basically like the 7 deadly sins, and they are personified into people. Honestly, this book just wasn't giving anything for me. I was bored. I didn't like the characters. The storyline just felt kind of all over the place. Honestly, the magic system in this book was not hard to learn at all. Like, it's just kind of in your face, and it's extremely beginner friendly. Honestly, there's a lot of beginner friendly books that I've read for fantasy because, like I've said, I'm not a seasoned fantasy reader, so you're not going to get me reading like super duper complicated ones. But a fantasy series that I love, this is a duology. This is the Dance of Thieves duology, and that is Dance of Thieves and Vow of Thieves. I love this duology so much. However, I do not feel like this is entirely beginner friendly because I remember reading Dance of Thieves. That is the first book in this little duology, and I remember being like super confused for the first 50 pages, and by the time that I had read Dance of Thieves, I had read quite a bit of fantasy books, so I was no longer like a super beginner. I'm still, like I said, not a seasoned professional. I'm trying to act like I know everything. With this one, I was a little confused for the first 50 pages, but then after I got over that, honestly, I felt that it was very simple, and you were just kind of following the storyline of these two people. This, enemies to lovers. Enemies to lovers. Guys, if you are getting into fantasy, welcome to the real enemies to lovers, because I have stopped categorizing like regular like rom-com-y romance books as enemies to lovers, because once you read fantasy and you read fantasy enemies to lovers, you will never go back. You will never go back. It just doesn't ever feel the same. This is my favorite, I think, enemies to lovers that I've ever read. The storyline of the Vow of Thieves specifically, I absolutely adored. I loved this one so much, but I love this duology together. And also, this is one of those books that like you start to understand the title after you've read the story, which I love when that happens. But honestly, I would say that this is like not super beginner friendly, but after you have a few fantasy books under your belt, I would say that you could very easily understand this one. It's not like the magic realm is like very hard. Again, it's more of like the characters and how everything connects with the characters is a little complicated, because you can get that in fantasy where the world building isn't super complicated, but it's more of like the magic system and the characters and how every single character connects and why this matters and why that matters and what happened in this war and what happened with that. Oh, I think I only have 2 other books on this stack that I've read. Actually, first of all, we have the Atlas 6. Now, I think actually this was the 2nd ever fantasy book that I've read, and I will say this, that this book was, I don't know if it was because Olivia Blake's writing is very, very lyrical, or because this was one of my first fantasy books. I would love to go back and gauge the reaction that I would have now. I just remember being kind of confused, but I feel like when I think back on it, like, and when I think about it now, I'm like, it wasn't super confusing, but I also did hear like other people say that they were a little confused. So honestly, I would not say that this is beginner friendly. The magic system is kind of a little bit difficult to learn in this book, but I never read the Atlas Paradox. If you guys read the Atlas Paradox, let me know if I should read it, because I do have it on my shelf, but I've just never read it. This is very much dark academia. They go to like a school, and they are, so only 5 can go through, and 6, obviously the Atlas 6 are picked, but only 5 will make it into like the program. And it's very much dark academia vibes, very much like everybody battling. It's been a while since I've read this book, but I remember liking it. And I would say though that this is not super beginner friendly. Best believe and still Bejeweled. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. You just had to be there. You had to be there when this was like the most hyped up book on Book Talk. This is the book that got me back into my obsession with reading. So for that, I will always appreciate this book. And I don't know if it was just because I was so excited to read something that was so incredibly hyped up and so like heavily regarded after not reading like physical books, because I'd been reading on Wattpad all throughout high school. We don't have to get into it. I would say this is not a beginner friendly book at all, because it is a very slow paced book. This book is basically, you were following Addie LaRue. What'd you guess? What'd you guess? And through this book, you are following her through years, like hundreds of years, because she basically makes a deal with what is essentially the devil, that she wants to live forever. She wants to live her own life. The clause, what do you call it? The clause of the agreement is that nobody remembers her. As soon as you turn your back to her, you will not remember who she is, why she is there, what she is doing. So that is like what she has to live with until one day she finds somebody that remembers her. But you're kind of getting this like back and forth. You're reading about her whole entire life, and it is fairly slow for you to get to the point point where like somebody actually remembers her for the first time, because you're also doing the story building of her character throughout all of these years. I will say it's extremely slow, and also it's a little difficult to understand at times. For that reasoning, I would say it's not very beginner friendly, because that's literally what I hear the most critiques about this book, is that it is very slow, and I do very much agree. It is an amazing story, so once you get a few fantasies under your belt, I would 100% recommend to read this book, because it holds a very special place in my heart, and I really enjoyed it. It is very repetitive, and it's very dragged out though, and I will say that my critique of this book is that when you were learning about her life, I feel like it could have been used for something like so much better than it was. It was not very interesting, and I don't necessarily feel that she did a lot. Like, I don't feel like there was a lot done from what I can remember. It has been literally like 2.5 years. Putting books up is always just the best part of filming a video. Now we're down to more of the bottom shelves. So, oh gosh, nervous to talk about this one. The Shatter Me series. I will tell you guys this. This is a dystopian fantasy. So this is kind of like more modern day, but it is it's in the dystopian realm of fantasy, which is a different kind of subcategory of a fantasy book, if you don't know what I mean. Divergent, The Hunger Games, there's not another one coming to mind, but this is also a dystopian fantasy. This is the Shatter Me series. If you have not heard of Aaron Warner yet, I honestly don't know how, because that was one of the first people that I ever heard about, and this is the series that he belongs to, if you were ever wondering that. And as you can maybe be able to tell, I don't love this series. I don't hate this series. It's just that I feel very indifferent towards it. I do think that it is a good series. I just never like think about the Shatter Me series, if that makes any sense. I love Aaron Warner as much as the next girl. Genuinely, I really do love Aaron Warner. But the thing is that he is not completely redeemable for me for this series. I do think that this is a extremely beginner friendly series. There is not a whole lot of world building. It does get a little twisty turny towards the last final 2 to 3 books, but not in a way where you won't understand it, especially after you have been reading the series. There are little novellas also that go in between. You can look up the reading order online. I'm pretty sure I have the reading order right here though, of like what everything is. You can get the little novellas in between and everything. But I honestly always feel like dystopian fantasy books are always pretty simple to read, and these are very easy. This is basically you're following Juliet. She's the main character that you're following. You start to get other characters' point of views in like the novellas and like later on down the road in the series, but you start off with Juliet, and she basically has the superpower that if she touches somebody, they die, and she's very alienated because of this. She's like in a mental asylum when you meet her, and she's very sporadic, and then you learn of like what her destiny is as you go throughout all of these books. Ooh, now we get to talk about a series that I really love. First of all, we have the Six of Crows duology, but I will first and foremost talk about the Shadow and Bone trilogy, because they take place in the same universe. There will be some books that are like this. If you are a very much beginner, you don't know where to start, there will be series that are like this. So for example, Shadow and Bone is a whole entire different series from the Six of Crows. There's also a Netflix show, but the thing is that these storylines don't intermix. Like, you don't need to read this trilogy before you read this duology. I wish I would have just like listened to that, because there are going to be people that just because this is in the same fantasy world, they're going to tell you, hey, read this before you read that. I'm going to tell you this, you do not have to. They like vaguely will like mention the characters in this book, because this trilogy does take place before that duology. But I will say this, you don't need to read this. And honestly, I didn't really love the Shadow and Bone trilogy. I liked the first book, but as the books went on, I just disliked them more and more. Like, in the way that Rude and Rising ended off, I honestly was so annoyed with, and I obviously can't get into it, but I just hate when authors in fantasy books do that. But anyway, the Shadow and Bone trilogy, you are following, what's her name? Elena, and she basically finds out that she has the superpower that she never knew that she had. And then there's this guy called the Darkling, and he wants to use her powers and like train her and stuff like that. So you are following kind of different storylines through each of these books. I just didn't love them, and I felt like there was a lot of very like, it was just kind of like all over the place. A lot of things were built up, and I was like, why was that built up? Because now you just tore it back down type of thing. Honestly, I didn't love the series as much as I love some other fantasy series, but this series is like highly regarded. Six of Crows duology. So you have Six of Crows and then Crooked Kingdom. This takes place in the same universe. So what I mean is that the characters do not connect. It just takes place in the same universe. So in the first book, they like briefly mention maybe a few times like what happened in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. But this one though, I just loved the storyline because the Six of Crows are a group of 6 people that basically are trying to pull off this heist, and it is just so good. I love Kaz with my whole entire heart. He is like the main guy. He is like the one who runs everything with the crows, and they're just like a group of 6 people who basically have nobody else except each other, and you're following them through this heist that goes on into Crooked Kingdom. It is just so good, guys. I kid you not, you will get so attached to these characters. You will just be wondering what's going to happen next. I love this duology so much, and I would say that honestly this is beginner friendly. Like, there's not too much magic involved. Like, they're not very magical in this book. It's more of just like pulling strings, and like I said, it's very much like a heist. Okay guys, we only have a few more series to talk about, and then I have to say farewell. This one I'm genuinely nervous about. The Cruel Prince trilogy. This is honestly probably, if you were trying to get into fantasy, I would probably again say about a 90% chance that you have seen the Cruel Prince trilogy. Let me tell you this before you even want to get into it. Do not listen to what people may have told you on TikTok. It is not a romance. That is what people very much do an injustice to this series by heavily talking about the romance. I will tell you something, the romance is not very much a part of this book. It is very much a tiny subplot when you get into this. This is a very politics based book, and let me break that down to you guys who may not understand what that means. Basically, in fantasy books there are a lot of politics involved, and that is when maybe there's like wars going on, or there's people that you need to talk to and understand why the inner workings of the world is this way, or most of the time is because there's a war or a battle of some sort, or there is somebody to defeat. So with this trilogy, it's just a lot of politics, and the romance subplot is very minuscule. Honestly, I feel like you may get it the most in this book, which is the final book in the trilogy, and still the romance that you get in this is not a lot. So please do not go into this expecting like this full like enemies to lovers, huge love plot line, because you're just not going to get it. You're not going to get it. But if you were looking for something a little bit more politics based, I would honestly recommend this series. However, I would say that I don't feel it is extremely beginner friendly. I don't feel like it's super complicated, but I don't feel like it's the series that you should jump into if you've never read a fantasy book before, because that is what I did. I read the Cruel Prince trilogy as like the first fantasy book that I'd really ever read before, and understood kind of nothing. On the same note, we have The Stolen Heir by the same author, Holly Black. Now this is another thing, guys, where this takes place in the same universe, and there are callbacks to the characters that are in the Cruel Prince trilogy, but it is not about them. There are some characters that were in the Cruel Prince trilogy in this. Basically, it is about like one of the guy in this book was in the Cruel Prince trilogy, but it's like years later after he's grown up, because he was a child in that book. But this is about like 2 completely different characters, a whole entire completely different plot line, and honestly, you can read The Stolen Heir without reading the Cruel Prince trilogy, but I would honestly just tell you to read the Cruel Prince trilogy and then get into this, just because you have a lot of background on the world. There's not a whole extensive lot of world building. There's a little bit and enough to make you understand what's going on, but there's not like building this whole entire magical realm. That's not really what's in this book. Honestly, when you go into The Stolen Heir, there's really no world building. I feel like probably because Holly Black expects it to be the people who have read The Cruel Prince are going to read this book, and not like people just reading this book. So I would recommend you reading The Cruel Prince. That way you do have the world building of this series, and then you go into this and you understand already like why, you know, she's on the outskirts and everything. I can only talk about one book by Cassandra Clare, and I do want to read more of her books, but once you start getting into fantasy, I will say that you will start seeing a lot more Cassandra Clare. People love her books, and I have only read the Mortal Instruments and the first book of the Mortal Instruments, which is City of Bones, and I will say that I did like this book. Just the way that it ended kind of rubbed me the wrong way, but that is not what we're talking about today. I will say that I did really enjoy her writing. This is another like modern fantasy. It takes place in like our time period, but it takes place like a few years ago, because it took place in the time period that she was writing this in, which is like, I think like, what was this? I want to say 2008, but I feel like that's wrong. 2007. I was not off. I was about to say, it gives me very much like early-ish 2000s vibes. So this takes place kind of like in 2007. Again, it's a modern fantasy, and I honestly really like modern fantasies a lot of the time because you don't have to build this like super make-believe world, because you're basically in your world. Especially in this book, you're in your world. It takes place in New York City, but there's just like these monsters and people with magic living amongst you that you don't even know, and there's like little secret places of magic that you don't even know exist and like you can't see. And I really like that. And basically the main girl learns that she is a part of this whole entire like magic realm, and she's looking for her mom, and she doesn't know what's going on, and she starts learning about powers and like all this magic stuff. But I do want to continue on because I did really like it, and I would honestly really recommend Cassandra Clare. I feel like it is beginner friendly because again, it's like since you are in this modern world, you're not building a super like make-believe world, and you know, all of that. Also, as a little side note that's fun, all of her books do that, where they make a little picture with the spines. Just thought that was a cute and fun detail. I only have 3 more books that I'm talking about. First of all, we're going to talk about Heartless. Now, Marissa Meyer is also a very big author in the fantasy realm. She has another series where it's basically a bunch of retellings. Like, I think the first one's called Cinder, and there are a bunch of like fairy tale retellings of like Cinderella and all the other princesses. I just read Heartless by her, and this is a Queen of Hearts retelling. It's basically essentially what a retelling means is just that they've taken another story and they have just basically retold it in their own way to fit like their own little story that they want to write. Actually, Acotar is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. I forgot to say that. I don't know how I forgot it. It's because honestly, once you get to the part and you're like, oh, I see why. But it's kind of very loosely a Beauty and the Beast retelling. But this one, it is very much a Queen of Hearts retelling, and you are learning about the story of the Queen of Hearts and like why she is the way that she is. It has a very fairy tale-esque vibe that if that is something that you're looking for, I would really recommend this one. I feel like it's such a good book for beginners. Okay, and then finally we're going to be talking about Carissa Broadbent because she is an author that I'm newly into. I actually just read Daughter of No Worlds. Finished that yesterday, but this is a little duology that I have finished by her, which is A Crowns of Nyxia. This is like the little duology that's from that little series of hers, and honestly, this was a 4.5-star series for me. I really liked it. This is, however, a like adult fantasy book, so I would definitely give this an 18+. So they're all vampires, and they are competing in what is essentially the Hunger Games in the first book. Obviously, I'm not going to tell you the plot of like the other books because it is very much spoiler territory. Aurea is the female MC of this little series, and she is a human. She's not a vampire, but she's competing with a bunch of vampires in what is essentially the Hunger Games to get this blessing from this god in their universe. I really loved this, the love interest in this book. I loved the first book more than I liked the second book, but I still really liked the second book. I honestly would recommend this as a beginner one. I really liked it for somebody who has been reading fantasy, but I don't feel like it's complicated. Like, there's not a whole lot of world building in it, and it's not a super complicated magic system because they're just vampires. Like, there's not like a whole lot to learn. I just would recommend this more for like a mature read. Okay guys, that is all of my teachings for you guys today. I hope you guys learned a little bit about some of the fantasy books, my favorite ones, what I recommend, and the beginner friendly ones. And hopefully, if you are new into the fantasy genre, you are gonna have a fun time reading. And like I said, honestly, sometimes it's hard to read a fantasy and then go back to romance because the stakes in fantasy books are just so much higher, and there's just so much more of a context. I'm a heavily romantasy reader. Romantasy is basically romance fantasy where there's like a heavy subplot of romance in the book. I live, breathe, and die. I eat that up. I love it so much. And you will more than likely learn to as well after you get through these books. Start off with Acotar. I love Acotar. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and got something out of it. If you guys did, you guys know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff that you guys know how to do. Don't forget, guys, I have a new podcast out with Bestie Sarah called Bookmarked. There's a YouTube channel for it and all of that stuff. Go listen to it on Spotify. I'm still working on Apple Podcasts for all of you Apple Podcast baddies. I don't know what's going on with it, but hopefully it is up by the time that this video comes out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I love all of you guys. Happy romantasy reading. I'll see you when I see ya. Peace.